Pack your bags, Nathan. Your portfolio belongs to my nephew now. Gerald Croft, our newly appointed CEO, sneered as he threw the termination paperwork across the mahogany conference table. The papers slid over the polished wood and stopped right against my coffee cup. His nephew, Brandon, sat next to him, wearing an oversized Rolex and a smug grin that belonged on a teenager rather than a wealth management executive. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply looked at the digital clock on the wall showing 3 in the afternoon, picked up my pen, and signed the release form. I knew something they completely forgot. 15 years ago, in 2011, when I first walked into Croft Wealth Management, the firm was operating out of a cramped suite on the 4th floor of a secondary office park in Chicago. Richard Croft, the founder and Gerald's father, was a brilliant old-school relationship manager. He had the charm, but he lacked the modern technical expertise to handle the shift toward automated, algorithmic trading, tax loss harvesting, and complex multi-generational family trusts. I was 33 back then, hungry, holding a master's degree in financial engineering, and tired of being a nameless analyst at a bulge bracket bank. Richard hired me on a handshake, promising me that if I built the firm's institutional desk from scratch, I would be protected. For the next decade and a half, I lived and breathed that office. I worked 80-hour weeks, flying across the country to meet with family patriarchs, drafting investment policy statements, and constructing custom portfolios that survived the market volatility of 2018 and the pandemic crash. I brought in the Sinclair family office, managed by Victor Sinclair, a conservative patriarch who made his fortune in industrial logistics. Then came Mercer Capital, a private investment pool controlled by Lawrence Mercer and eventually the Miller Family Trust. These 3 accounts alone represented $1.2 billion in assets under management. To put that in perspective, Croft Wealth Management managed a total of $3.2 billion across all its clients. My portfolio represented almost 40% of the firm's entire revenue stream. Because of my performance, the firm grew, moved to a high-rise downtown, and hired dozens of support staff. But I wasn't naive. I knew that in the financial sector, loyalty is a commodity that is traded for basis points. When I first brought Victor Sinclair and Lawrence Mercer to the firm in 2014, I insisted on a specific employment agreement. I knew Richard Croft was eager to secure these massive accounts because he needed to hit the $3 billion asset mark to qualify for a $450 million revolving credit facility from a major Wall Street lender. That credit facility was the lifeblood of the firm, allowing them to fund their proprietary private equity deals and expand their offices. But the lender had a strict debt covenant. If Croft's total assets under management ever fell below $2.5 billion for more than 5 consecutive business days, the loan would go into default, triggering immediate foreclosure on the firm's corporate assets. Knowing how much leverage I held, I had my personal attorney draft Clause 14C of my employment agreement. It was a standard keyman provision, but with a highly specific trigger. The clause stated that if my employment with Croft Wealth Management was terminated for any reason other than gross misconduct, or if I resigned due to a material reduction in my responsibilities, the clients in my designated portfolio would be granted a 48-hour window to terminate their advisory contracts with Croft without paying any exit fees or early termination penalties. Furthermore, the clause authorized the immediate transfer of their account data, historical performance records, and custody transition forms to any new registered investment advisory or custodian bank of my choosing. Richard Croft read the clause, grumbled about it over a glass of scotch, but ultimately signed it. He knew that without my clients, he wouldn't get the loan, and without the loan, the firm would go under. For years, that contract sat in a secure digital vault, forgotten by everyone except me and the firm's external general counsel, who had retired 3 years ago. Then, 6 months ago, Richard Croft suffered a stroke and decided to officially step down. Instead of promoting me or hiring an external professional to run the firm, the board, dominated by the Croft family's trust, appointed Richard's eldest son, Gerald. Gerald was a country club executive. He had never passed his licensing exams on the first try, had never built a client portfolio from scratch, and viewed the firm as a personal ATM. He drove a sports car paid for by corporate expense accounts and spent more time on golf courses than in investment committee meetings. Within his first month, Gerald began making noise about restructuring the commission splits. Under my original agreement, I received a percentage of the advisory fees generated by my portfolio. Gerald wanted to cut that percentage in half, claiming the firm's overhead had increased. I flatly refused, pointing to my contract. Gerald backed down temporarily, but I saw the writing on the wall. He began shadowing my meetings with Victor Sinclair and Lawrence Mercer, trying to build a direct relationship with them. He was clumsy, talking about golf and luxury yachts to men who had built their empires on manufacturing margins and logistics efficiency. They tolerated him out of respect for his father, but they always looked to me when it came to actual investment decisions. 2 weeks ago, Gerald introduced his nephew, Brandon. Brandon was 28, fresh out of a low-tier business school, and possessed an unearned arrogance that only nepotism can buy. Gerald announced that Brandon would be joining my team as a senior partner and that I would be responsible for training him to take over the day-to-day management of my key accounts. "Brandon is the future of this firm, Nathan," Gerald told me in a private meeting. "He needs to start managing the big relationships. You've had a good run, but we need fresh blood at the top." I looked at Brandon, who was busy checking his phone under the table. I knew exactly what Gerald was doing. He wanted to transfer the client relationships to his nephew, so he could claw back my commission split and keep the entire fee structure within the family. He thought he could use me to transition the clients and then push me out once Brandon was fully integrated. What Gerald didn't understand was that you don't build a 15-year relationship with billionaires by introducing them to a kid who doesn't know the difference between a tax-exempt municipal bond and a high-yield corporate note. I kept my composure, nodded, and agreed to let Brandon sit in on the quarterly portfolio reviews. It was the beginning of the end, but not my end. I had already made a phone call to my attorney to pull the original 2011 contract from the archives. The stage was set, and Gerald was about to walk right into the trap he was digging for me. Over the next 3 weeks, Brandon proved to be even more incompetent than I had anticipated. He showed up to the office late, usually around 10 in the morning, smelling of expensive cologne and stale energy drinks. During our portfolio reviews, he struggled to understand the basic mechanics of our tax loss harvesting software. He didn't know how to read a compliance dashboard or how to execute a complex trade ticket across multiple custodian accounts. In a meeting with Lawrence Mercer, Brandon actually suggested allocating 20% of Mercer's conservative income portfolio into volatile, unrated commercial real estate debt. Lawrence Mercer, a man who had built a shipping empire by analyzing cargo manifests and managing razor-thin operating margins, slowly lowered his glasses. He stared at Brandon with a look of quiet disbelief before turning his gaze back to me. I stepped in immediately, explaining that we were currently rebalancing towards short-term treasury bills to maximize yield while waiting out the interest rate cycle. Lawrence nodded, satisfied, and ignored Brandon for the rest of the meeting. After the client left, Brandon threw a tantrum in my office. "You cut me off, Nathan," he snapped, pacing in front of my desk. "I was trying to show him we can get better returns. You're too conservative. Uncle Gerald says you're stuck in the past." "Mr. Mercer doesn't want returns that come with high volatility, Brandon," I said calmly, looking up from my screen. "He wants capital preservation. He has a Series 7 license from 30 years ago. He knows exactly what you were trying to sell him, and he knows it's junk. If you want to pitch deals like that, do it with the speculative accounts, not a mature family office." Brandon stormed out, muttering under his breath. I knew he went straight to Gerald's office to complain. The tipping point came on a Tuesday. My daughter, Olivia, was graduating from her university in Boston. It was a milestone I had promised myself I wouldn't miss. Over the last 15 years, I had missed anniversaries, birthdays, and school events to build this firm. I had worked through holidays and answered client emails at 2 in the morning from hotel rooms. But this graduation was non-negotiable. I submitted a formal request for a single day of paid leave for the following Friday. It was a simple request, submitted 2 weeks in advance, during a period where the markets were relatively quiet. I had already set up automated rebalancing scripts for all my portfolios, and my junior analyst was fully prepared to handle any routine inquiries. The next morning, the HR system flagged my request as denied. I assumed it was a system error, so I walked down the hall to Gerald's corner office. Through the glass, I could see Brandon sitting on the leather sofa, laughing at something on his tablet. Gerald was at his desk, signing expense reports. I knocked and walked in. "Gerald, do you have a minute?" The portal showing my leave request for next Friday was flagged as denied. I assumed it was an administrative glitch. Gerald didn't look up from his papers. "Not a glitch, Nathan. I denied it." I stood there, momentarily stunned by his dismissive tone. "You denied it? I submitted it 2 weeks ago. My daughter is graduating. The portfolio rebalancing is already programmed, and my team is covering the desk." Gerald finally looked up. Leaning back in his leather chair, he folded his hands over his stomach. "It's the second week of the quarter, Nathan. We have a scheduled compliance review, and I need Brandon to present the quarterly performance metrics to the board. I need you here to make sure he doesn't hit any snags. You can miss a graduation. She's graduating. It's not like she's getting married." "My daughter's graduation is not something I am going to miss, Gerald," I said, keeping my voice level and controlled. "I haven't taken a single unscheduled day off in 5 years. The board presentation is already prepared. Brandon has the slides and all the data is in the system. There is absolutely no reason for me to be in the office next Friday." Brandon chimed in from the couch. "Honestly, Nathan, it looks like you're just trying to avoid helping me. If you can't be bothered to support the team during a board review, maybe you're not as committed to the firm as you claim." I ignored Brandon and kept my eyes on Gerald. "I am going to Boston on Friday, Gerald. I am letting you know now so you can make whatever arrangements you think are necessary." Gerald's face turned red. He stood up, slamming his hand on the desk. "You don't dictate terms to me, Nathan. I am the CEO of this firm. You work for me. If I tell you to be at that board meeting, you will be in that chair at 9 in the morning. If you think your personal family events are more important than the multi-billion-dollar portfolios we manage, then you have your priorities completely backward." "My priorities are exactly where they should be," I answered. "The portfolios are secure and automated. The client relationship managers are briefed. I am taking Friday off." "This is insubordination, Nathan," Gerald shouted. "You think you're indispensable because you have a relationship with Sinclair and Mercer. You think you run this place. But let me tell you something. Those clients belong to Croft Wealth Management. They sign contracts with the firm, not with you. We built this infrastructure. We gave you the platform." He grabbed a folder from his desk drawer and threw it toward me. It was a termination agreement. "I've had enough of your arrogance," Gerald sneered, his voice trembling with anger. "If you walk out of this office today to go to Boston, don't bother coming back. In fact, you're done today. I'm terminating your contract immediately for insubordination. We'll pay out your standard severance, but your client list and all your accounts are being transferred to Brandon effective immediately. You're done." I looked at the paperwork. I looked at Brandon, who was grinning, clearly pleased with the outcome. He thought he was about to inherit a $1.2 billion portfolio and a massive annual commission pool without doing any of the actual work. I took a deep breath. I didn't yell. I didn't argue. I reached into my jacket pocket, pulled out my Mont Blanc pen, and signed the termination document. I pushed it back across the desk. "Understood," I said quietly. "Get your personal belongings and get out of the building by 5, Gerald said, trying to regain his composure. "Our security team will escort you. And don't try to download any client files. All your access codes have already been revoked." "I don't need to download anything," I said. I turned around and walked out of the office. I walked back to my desk, picked up my briefcase, my framed photo of Olivia, and my physical notebook. I didn't touch the computer. I didn't need to. The plan was already in motion, and the countdown had officially started. I walked out at 4:30, carrying a box of my personal belongings. The security guard, Brian, whom I bought coffee for daily, looked embarrassed as he escorted me to the lobby. "I'm sorry, Mr. Vance," Brian muttered under his breath as we reached the revolving doors. "Just doing my job." "I know, Brian." "Take care of yourself," I said with a smile. I walked out into the cool Chicago air, put my box in the trunk of my sedan, and sat in the driver's seat. I didn't feel angry. In fact, for the first time in 15 years, I felt a strange sense of relief. Gerald had just done the one thing I couldn't do myself. He had cut the cord. I pulled out my phone and dialed my personal attorney, a sharp contract specialist named Roger Finch. "Roger, it's Nathan," I said. "Gerald just fired me. Insubordination." I signed the termination paperwork. I could hear Roger rustling papers on the other end of the line. Did he cite gross misconduct in the termination document? No. He checked the box for insubordination and failure to comply with management directives. He was too angry to think about the legal implications. "Beautiful," Roger said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. "Under Illinois employment law, insubordination is not classified as gross misconduct unless it involves an illegal act or direct threat to safety. A dispute over a leave request is a standard termination without cause. Clause 14C is officially active. The 48-hour clock is running. I'm calling the clients now," I said. "Prepare the custody transfer documents for BNY Mellon." "They're already drafted, Nathan. I've had them ready since you called me last week. Once you get the client signatures, I'll submit them directly to the custodian bank's institutional transition desk." We hung up, and I made my first call to Victor Sinclair. Victor was at his lake house in Wisconsin, probably drinking a scotch on the deck. "Victor, it's Nathan," I said. "I wanted to let you know that I am no longer with Croft Wealth Management. I was terminated this afternoon." There was a long silence on the line. Then Victor's deep, gravelly voice came through. "Terminated? For what?" "I requested next Friday off to attend my daughter Olivia's graduation from Boston University." Gerald denied the request, claiming I needed to stay behind to cover for Brandon during the board presentation. When I told him I was going anyway, he fired me. Victor let out a dry, harsh laugh. "That arrogant little idiot. He really thinks he can run that firm on his father's coattails, and he thinks he can assign your nephew Brandon to my account. The kid who suggested I put $20 million into high-risk real estate junk bonds? Yes, Victor. Gerald's plan is to have Brandon take over your portfolio." "Not on my watch," Victor said firmly. "Nathan, you've managed my family's wealth for 12 years. You saved us $8 million in taxes during the restructuring of our logistics business, and you kept our heads above water during the crash. I'm not leaving my money with a kid who can't read a balance sheet. What's the plan?" I registered a new independent registered investment advisory last month called Vance Asset Management. We are set up as an RIA with BNY Mellon as our primary custodian. Under Clause 14C of my contract, because I was terminated without cause, you have the right to terminate your agreement with Croft immediately without any exit fees and transfer your assets to my new firm. I have the documents ready. Send them over," Victor said without hesitation. "I'll sign them within the hour. Call Lawrence and Donald. Let's get this done before the markets open on Monday." Next, I called Lawrence Mercer. Lawrence was even less polite about Gerald than Victor had been. He was furious that Gerald had tried to leverage my work to promote his incompetent family members. "Nathan, my father always told me to invest in the horse, not the stable," Lawrence said. "You are the horse. Croft is just the stable, and the new stable master is a clown. Send me the transfer forms. I'll have my corporate counsel sign off on them immediately." By 7 the evening, Donald Henderson, the sole trustee for the Miller Family Trust, had also agreed. The three patriarchs were united. They weren't just loyal to me, they were businessmen who understood risk. Leaving their combined $1.2 billion with Gerald and Brandon was a massive financial risk they were simply not willing to take. By 10 o'clock that night, Roger Finch had received signed custody transfer authorizations from all three family offices. He immediately uploaded them to BNY Mellon's secure institutional portal. But I wasn't finished. On Saturday morning, I drafted a formal notification letter to Lincoln National Bank. They were the institutional lender that had provided the $450 million revolving credit facility to Croft Wealth Management. The notification was simple. As the registered keyman under the loan agreement, I was legally obligated to notify the lender of my termination. Furthermore, I attached the signed custody transfer documents, proving that the Sinclair, Mercer, and Miller portfolios representing $1.2 billion in assets, were being removed from Croft's management. This meant Croft's total assets under management would drop from $3.2 billion to $2 billion by Monday morning. This was a direct, catastrophic breach of the $2.5 billion debt covenant. I sent the email to the lead loan officer at Lincoln National Bank at 9:30 on Saturday morning. I knew that by Monday at 9, their compliance department would be calling Gerald Croft. The fuse was lit. All I had to do now was wait for the explosion. Monday morning arrived, and I spent it sitting on my back porch in a pair of comfortable jeans, drinking a freshly brewed cup of coffee. The sun was warm, and for the first time in 15 years, my phone wasn't ringing with market alerts or emergency client emails. Or rather, it wasn't ringing with their emergencies. At 8:45, my phone screen lit up. It was Gerald Croft. I let it go to voicemail. 3 minutes later, another call came in. This time it was Brandon. I declined it. By 9:15, I had 7 missed calls from Gerald, 3 from Brandon, and 2 from the firm's head of operations. I decided to log into BNY Mellon's institutional portal using my new Vance Asset Management credentials. The system interface was clean, and there they were: the Sinclair Family Office, Mercer Capital, and the Miller Family Trust. The transfer was complete. $1.2 billion in assets had successfully migrated to my custodian account. My new firm was officially operational, and my clients' funds were safe under my direct fiduciary management. Meanwhile, over at the Croft offices, the panic was just beginning. I later learned from a junior analyst, who texted me that Brandon had walked into the morning investment meeting with a smug grin, holding a leather folder. He sat at the head of the conference table and opened his laptop, planning to show the team how he was going to restructure my accounts. But when he logged into the internal portfolio management system, his screen showed a massive red error message. The Sinclair, Mercer, and Miller accounts, which usually sat at the top of the dashboard, were gone. The balance fields read 0.00. Brandon assumed it was a database glitch and called the IT desk, screaming at them to fix the interface. But the IT director, after checking the database, informed him that the custody links had been severed at the bank level. BNY Mellon had revoked Croft's trading credentials and asset visibility at exactly 8:30 that morning, acting on signed directives from the account owners. While Brandon was screaming at IT, Gerald's private line rang. It was the managing director of Lincoln National Bank. The bank's compliance algorithms had flagged the sudden drop in Croft's assets under management. With the loss of my 3 major accounts, Croft's AUM had plummeted to $2 billion, a direct violation of the $2.5 billion threshold required by their $450 million loan covenant. The bank officer was cold and professional. He informed Gerald that the credit facility was being frozen immediately. No further funds could be drawn to support their private equity projects, and the firm had exactly 5 business days to restore the AUM to the minimum required level, or the bank would call the entire outstanding loan balance. For a firm like Croft, which relied on that credit line to maintain leverage and fund their daily operations, a loan recall was a death sentence. They didn't have $450 million in liquid cash. If the bank called the loan, Croft Wealth Management would be forced into involuntary bankruptcy and liquidation within a month. By 10 o'clock, my phone was buzzing almost continuously. Gerald had left 5 voicemails, his voice progressing from arrogant irritation to high-pitched panic. At 10:30, I finally picked up. "Nathan," Gerald roared as soon as the line connected. "What the hell did you do? You stole our clients. You had them sign transfer documents before you left. This is a violation of your non-compete. It's a breach of fiduciary duty, and I am going to sue you for every dime you have." "Good morning, Gerald," I said, keeping my voice calm and steady. "I didn't steal anyone. The clients made a voluntary choice to transfer their assets, and as for the non-compete, I suggest you consult with your legal department. You signed a non-compete. Nathan, you can't manage our clients for 2 years after leaving this firm. Gerald, your father signed my 2011 employment agreement, and you inherited that contract when you took over," I explained patiently. "Under Clause 14C, If I am terminated by the firm for any reason other than gross misconduct, the non-compete is rendered null and void. Furthermore, the contract explicitly grants the clients in my portfolio the right to terminate their agreements with Croft and transfer their data to my new Raya within 48 hours. There was a sudden, heavy silence on the line. I could hear Gerald's rapid, shallow breathing. Insubordination is not gross misconduct under Illinois law, Gerald, I continued. You terminated me because I wanted to attend my daughter's graduation. That is a termination without cause. The transfer is perfectly legal, and BNY Mellon has already processed the authorization forms. Nathan, wait. Gerald's tone suddenly shifted. The anger was gone, replaced by a desperate pleading note. We can work this out. We can create a new partnership. I'll give you the senior partner title you wanted, and we can keep your commission split exactly where it was. Heck, I'll even increase it by 5 basis points. We just need to get the assets back into the Croft portal today. The bank is freezing our line, Nathan. If we don't fix this by Friday, the firm is done. The assets are already registered under Vance Asset Management, Gerald. The transfer is irreversible, and even if I wanted to come back, my clients wouldn't. Victor Sinclair and Lawrence Mercer have no interest in letting their money be managed by a firm where a CEO throws tantrums and tries to force his incompetent nephew onto their accounts. You can't do this to my family's legacy, Nathan, Gerald pleaded. My father built this firm. Your father did build it, Gerald, and he was a good man. But you destroyed it in 3 weeks because you thought you could treat a multi-billion-dollar business like your personal playground. You wanted to play corporate chess, but you forgot to read the rules. Nathan, please. I have to go, Gerald. I have a flight to Boston to catch. My daughter is graduating tomorrow, and unlike you, I don't miss my commitments. I hung up the phone. I blocked Gerald's number, Brandon's number, and the office main line. I walked back inside my house to pack my suitcase. The storm had hit Croft Wealth Management, and there was nothing left for them to do but watch their empire wash away. I spent the weekend in Boston. I sat in the crowded University Stadium, watching my daughter Olivia walk across the stage to receive her degree in biochemistry. When her name was called, my wife and I stood up and cheered, our voices lost in the roar of the crowd. I didn't look at my phone once. I didn't think about AUM, covenants, or the Croft family. In that moment, I realized exactly how much of my life I had given to a company that valued me only as a column on a spreadsheet, and how right I was to walk away. While I was celebrating with my family, the financial gears at Lincoln National Bank were turning. On Tuesday morning, the 5-day cure period for Croft Wealth Management's covenant breach expired. Gerald had spent the weekend desperately calling other investment advisors, offering ridiculous terms to get them to bring their portfolios over to Croft. But word travels fast in the wealth management industry. Everyone knew that Croft was on the verge of a credit default, and no sane advisor was going to jump onto a sinking ship. By Wednesday morning, Lincoln National Bank officially declared a default on the $450 million revolving credit facility. They froze all of Croft's corporate operating accounts and began the legal process of calling the loan. The news hit the financial press by Thursday afternoon. A headline in a prominent business journal read, Boutique Chicago Raya Croft Wealth Management faces default after key portfolio manager departs with $1.2 billion. That headline was the final nail in the coffin. Wealth management is built entirely on trust. When clients see a headline about a credit default and a major portfolio manager leaving, they don't wait to see how it plays out. They pull their money. By Friday afternoon, a full-scale run had begun on Croft's remaining assets. Mid-level clients, who represented the other $2 billion in AUM, began calling the office, demanding that their accounts be liquidated or transferred to other firms. Within 10 days, Croft's total assets under management plummeted from the remaining $2 billion to less than $400 million. The firm's fee revenue evaporated overnight. With their bank accounts frozen and their assets depleted, they couldn't even meet their payroll obligations for the end of the month. On the second Friday after my termination, Croft Wealth Management filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The firm's corporate assets, including their high-rise office lease, their proprietary trading software licenses, and their office furniture, were put up for liquidation. Gerald Croft was forced to resign as CEO in disgrace, and his family trust, which was tied up in the firm's equity, lost almost 90% of its value. Brandon's career in high finance was over before it had even begun. No reputable firm in Chicago would hire a kid whose primary achievement was destroying a 15-year-old wealth advisory business in less than a month. Meanwhile, Vance Asset Management was thriving. My attorney, Roger Finch, secured a modest but modern office suite on the edge of the financial district. We didn't need a massive high-rise space. We just needed a secure network, a few desks, and a quiet conference room. Because Victor Sinclair, Lawrence Mercer, and the Miller Family Trust had transferred their assets, our firm started day one with $1.2 billion under management. At a standard advisory fee of 75 basis points, that portfolio generated $9 million in annual recurring revenue. Without Gerald's bloated corporate overhead, his sports cars, or his country club expenses, our operating costs were minimal. I immediately reached out to 3 of the senior analysts and 2 of the operations specialists who had been laid off during Croft's liquidation. They were hard-working, talented people who had been caught in the crossfire of Gerald's incompetence. I hired them at salaries 20% higher than what Croft had paid them, and I set up a transparent, merit-based commission structure. They knew the clients, they knew the systems, and they were thrilled to work in an environment where their efforts were actually recognized. A month after the liquidation began, my private phone rang. It was an unrecognized number, but I decided to answer. Nathan, a weak, raspy voice, said. It was Richard Croft. I sat back in my chair. Richard, it's good to hear your voice. How are you feeling? I've been better, Nathan, the old man sighed. I'm calling to apologize. I saw what happened. I saw the bankruptcy filings. I'm sorry it had to end that way, Richard. I truly am. I had a lot of respect for what you built. I know you did, Nathan, and you protected it for 15 years. I told Gerald when I retired that you were the glue holding that place together. I told him to treat you right. But he has his mother's arrogance and none of my common sense. He thought he could outsmart the contract. He thought he could outsmart you. He was greedy, Richard. He wanted to take what wasn't his. He did, Richard agreed, his voice cracking slightly. He ruined the family name, and he ruined his father's legacy. But I don't blame you, Nathan. You did what any good businessman would do. You protected your clients, and you protected yourself. I just wanted to wish you luck with the new firm. Thank you, Richard. That means a lot to me. We hung up, and I looked out the window of my new office, watching the traffic flow down Michigan Avenue. Sometimes in business, people mistake patience for weakness. They think that because you don't scream, because you don't fight back immediately, and because you work quietly in the background, you are easy to walk over. Gerald and Brandon thought they could push me out and steal the work of a lifetime, assuming I would just take my severance and disappear. They forgot that in the world of high finance, the real power doesn't belong to the person with the loudest voice or the biggest office. It belongs to the person who holds the trust of the clients and the person who knows how to read the fine print. I took a sip of my coffee, turned back to my dual-screen terminal, and began preparing the week market update for Victor, Lawrence, and Donald. I was no longer an employee trying to prove my worth to a greedy heir. I was the master of my own firm, and the future had never looked brighter.